Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jeffrey Epstein Show. I'm your host, Bobbycapucci, and this is an episode of the evolution of the Epstein Chronicles. Today, we're going to hop into the time machine and go flying on back to 2015 to a New York Times article that has to do with Alan Dershowitz. And I'm very interested to see the way this article presents Dershowitz's involvement in the case, and I'm very interested to see the way he defends himself in this article. Now, mind you, this was 4 years ago. This was before Jeffrey Epstein was arrested again, and we know that Dershowitz has been yelling from all the rooftops that he can get his feet on that he had nothing to do with this, and that Virginia Roberts is a liar. My stance on all of it is, if you're going to believe Virginia Roberts about one thing, you have to believe her about everything. And folks, I have to tell you, I believe her about everything. In my opinion, everything she said happened. That's what happens when you provide not only your word, but evidence. And there is so much corroborating evidence at this point. All the other girls that were abused with the same MO. All the other people that were involved. All of these other cases, they all run concurrent with each other. They all run in the same direction. And when you have all of this evidence, and basically none of it is circumstantial at this point, we have the goods, right? We pretty much know that Prince Andrew was with Virginia Roberts, and it's pretty much looking like the evidence is pretty much pointing to the fact that he did do what she said. And if he did do what she said, and I believe he did, well, that leads me to believe that Dershowitz is also guilty in this. And the way he has went crazy with his defense and at every turn trying to demean these girls is just absolutely abhorrent to me, and I couldn't let it escape my notice. He has to be called out on that, so we're going to blow him up right now, and we're going to go back into this article from 2015 and see what this article looks like then and how it's evolved to today. So, before I do that, if you would like to contact me, you can do that at bobbycapucci@protonmail.com. That's BOBBYCAPUCCI@protonmail.com. All right, let's hop into this article. This is an article from 2015, like I said. It's from the New York Times, and the author of the article is Barry Meyer. It was published on December 12th, 2015. The headline, Alan Dershowitz on the defense, his own. Last month, demonstrators at Johns Hopkins University interrupted Alan Dershowitz as he was giving a fiery speech defending Israel. The disruption normally would not have fazed Mr. Dershowitz, a former Harvard Law School professor who thrives on controversy and relishes taking on opponents in and out of the courtroom. The protesters, however, were not challenging his Middle East politics. Instead, they held up a sign reading, "You are rape culture." Oh, wow, zinger. And I don't blame them. Usually I have a problem with a lot of these protests that get astroturfed up. They're not really true protests. They're, manufactured. But in this case, this is actual rage. People know what Dershowitz is up to, and they know the people that he's defended. It's pretty gross, honestly. I'll just call a spade a spade. And I think Dershowitz he's really beyond the pale of gross at this point. Mr. Dershowitz knew what it meant. A decade ago, he had defended a friend, a money manager named Jeffrey E. Epstein, after authorities in Palm Beach, Florida, found evidence indicating that he was paying underage girls to give him sexual massages. All right, let's back up there. A money manager? You mean pedophile. The lawyer led a scorched earth attack on the girls and, with a team of high-priced lawyers, cut a plea deal for Mr. Epstein that the local police said was too lenient. Not just the local police said that, all right? You had tribes in Africa who said that. You had people in the mountains of Kentucky who said that. Everybody in the world, all right? Everybody in the world knew that was a lenient deal. Everybody in the world knew that it was bull. Every single person knew it. Dershowitz knew it. Everybody that worked on the team knew it, and they didn't care. Over a 5-decade career, Mr. Dershowitz has represented some of America's most prominent criminal defendants, including O.J. Simpson, Leona Helmsley, Mike Tyson, and Klaus von Bülow. Now, he finds himself on the other side, in a legal battle to clear his own name. At 77, he is struggling to absorb a bitter lesson that choosing the wrong client can exact its own cost. Really? Again, so what is the Times scared of him? Virginia Roberts' claims were already on record at this point. Dershowitz had been named by her at this point. And they're saying, oh, they want us to feel sorry for him. At 77, he is struggling to absorb a bitter lesson. You know what a bitter lesson is? A bitter lesson is what Virginia Roberts took at the hands of Jeffrey Epstein. A very bitter lesson. A lesson that was unneeded. A lesson that if there was a man amongst you would have stood up and said, God damn all of you, how dare you? Because that's what men do. All right. You don't need a limp-wristed, well, maybe I should do this. Maybe I shouldn't do this. That's not the kind of person you need to take on these people, folks. You need a straight up pit bull who is not going to care, who can meet them on their own turf and will not be intimidated. And these kind of journalists who write these articles where they limp-wrist around these people because they're scared of them and shit, well, I ain't got no time for that. Last December, as part of a filing in an ongoing lawsuit, a woman charged that Mr. Dershowitz had sex with her when she was underage. That's Virginia Roberts. Mr. Dershowitz called the claim an outrageous lie, and over the last year has faced fallout from the accusation. Poor Mr. Dershowitz, facing fallout. How about having your whole life ruined like these girls did? How about that? Come talk to me when that happens to you. This is very serious, Mr. Dershowitz said last month in his apartment in Manhattan. It involves my life, my legacy, my career, my history, and my reputation. Well, you should have thought about that before you kept your underwear on. And you know you were rocking them tighty whities, right? Everybody knows Dershowitz was up there looking like the Crypt Keeper in a pair of tighty whities. Come on now. These poor girls, that alone is traumatizing. As he has defended that legacy, there has been a lawsuit, a counterclaim, and even an accusation of an extortion plot against the billionaire Leslie X. Wexner, the chairman of L Brands, the retail empire that includes Victoria's Secret and Henry Bendel. I've never even heard of Henry Bendel. What in the world is that? Probably some like high-end nonsense. It also has pitted Mr. Dershowitz against another of the nation's most famous lawyers, David Boies, who represents his accuser. The two lawyers are in an increasingly virulent war. In October, Mr. Dershowitz testified in a deposition that Mr. Boies had privately assured Mr. Dershowitz that he did not believe the claims of his client, Virginia Roberts. He said that he would not have taken this case if they had known she was going to accuse me, Mr. Dershowitz said recently. Really? Why would he say that? As if you're this guy, this person that other high-profile lawyers should even be scared of. Dershowitz has a very high opinion of himself, folks. And him trying to weasel his way onto that whole Trump impeachment team is just not a good look for Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump lets him onto that legal team, you better believe the minute after it's announced, I will be on here scorching the earth because it is disgusting to even think about. Acosta and this guy around you? Really? Mr. Boies responded that he never made such a statement. The only explanation I have is that he is so emotional about this that he starts saying things without being careful, Mr. Boies said in an interview. He has been someone whose approach in litigation is to attack the other side. In recent weeks, efforts to resolve the thicket of legal actions have begun, but Mr. Dershowitz insists that any settlement must clear him of sexual wrongdoing. The woman accusing Mr. Dershowitz has not filed a complaint with the authorities or a lawsuit against him. Instead, her allegation first emerged in a lawsuit that challenged Mr. Epstein's plea agreement. Mr. Dershowitz long taught his students that everyone, even those charged with the most heinous crimes, deserves a defense. But he now says he hesitated when Mr. Epstein called him in 2006 to ask him for help because he was being investigated in connection with sex crimes. Yeah, right. Yeah, effing right. All of a sudden, I was worried to take the case. You and him were boys. You guys were chopping it up. You were glad to take this case. And not only were you glad to take this case, you were glad to bury these girls with that shitty plea agreement. I said, look, Jeffrey, we're acquaintances. Maybe that's not such a great idea, Mr. Dershowitz said. He said, no, I really need you to do this. The case, Mr. Dershowitz realized, was right in my wheelhouse. Yeah, of course it was, because you're one of his boys, right? If Virginia Roberts is to be believed, you're not only one of his boys, you're also a sexual offender. How many other girls were you with at Mr. Epstein's? If they were overage even, how many girls were you with because of your relationship with him, Mr. Dershowitz? You can't run around talking about, I'm going to sue everybody. Bah. You need to answer some questions, homie. In December 2005, a few months before he got that phone call, Mr. Dershowitz, his wife, children, and grandchildren were vacationing at Mr. Epstein's Palm Beach mansion. Vacationing at his mansion? What does that even mean? The mansion wasn't even this great place. It was kind of a weak sauce mansion compared to the other ones around his pad. So what do you mean you're vacationing at his mansion? You don't have the money to get a hotel room? Who wants to go and stay at their friend's place? The friendship between the men started in the mid-1990s on Martha's Vineyard. Not long after they met, Mr. Epstein invited Mr. Dershowitz to a birthday party for Mr. Wexner. And there's the Mr. Wexner name again. He is so deeply involved in this, folks. Instead of accepting presents, the retail magnate had a tradition of asking friends to bring the most interesting person they had met over the last year. He said, "I'd like to bring you," Mr. Dershowitz said. By any measure, Mr. Dershowitz had led an interesting life. At 28, after clerking for a Supreme Court justice, Mr. Dershowitz became the youngest professor ever hired by Harvard Law School. It was outside the classroom, however, where his fame grew. He handled celebrated cases, appeared as a television commentator, and wrote many books, fiction and nonfiction. His account of the Von Bulow case, Reversal of Fortune, was made into a film in 1990 in which the actor Ron Silver donned a bushy mustache and aviator glasses to play Mr. Dershowitz. Oh, what a great puff piece this is turning into, huh? Like I said, you see the way they write about these people, even though they're accused of these heinous crimes? This is your New York Times. This is the Gray Lady. This is why I hardly read anything from this publication. Along with enjoying celebrity, Mr. Dershowitz has also relished those he considers foes. He has relished excoriating those he considers foes. He has taken on journalists, chided universities for coddling students, and has been relentless in his defense of Israel. For example, accusing the writer Alice Walker of bigotry for refusing to allow an Israeli publisher to translate her novel The Color Purple. Soon after meeting Mr. Epstein, Mr. Dershowitz became drawn into a rarefied world. Mr. Epstein was an enigmatic figure living in an Upper West East Side mansion once owned by Mr. Wexner, who had reportedly been his mentor. A college dropout who once worked for Bear Stearns, Mr. Epstein said he handled investments for billionaires, though other than Mr. Wexner, he declined to identify them. That's because they didn't exist. The other billionaires he was talking about, well, those were the intelligence agencies, in my opinion. That's whose money he was handling. Along with prominent businessmen, Mr. Epstein's friends included scientists, socialites, and celebrities. He donated $30 million to finance scientific research at Harvard. President Bill Clinton and the actor Kevin Spacey flew aboard his private jet to Africa to discuss an AIDS policy. Mr. Dershowitz also traveled on Mr. Epstein's plane and was invited to join his chats with Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister. The men grew so close that Mr. Dershowitz solicited Mr. Epstein's feedbacks as he was writing books. But he was just there as a lawyer. I don't know, Jeffrey. I don't know if I can defend you. We aren't really that close. Vacationing at his house, hanging out with prime ministers, going to Israel with him, and I'm sure meeting up for a mega group meeting, because we all know that both of these folks were involved with the mega group. In the interview in his Manhattan apartment, Mr. Dershowitz said Mr. Epstein was often surrounded by young women, but none struck him as underage. "I never got involved in his social life," he said, "unless you were getting a massage in your tighty-whities, Crypt Keeper." However, in late 2005, around the time when Mr. Dershowitz and his family were vacationing at Mr. Epstein's home, Palm Beach detectives were sifting through trash outside. Acting on a tip, the authorities were investigating whether women working as assistants to Mr. Epstein were finding teenage girls to give him sexual massages. As the inquiry unfolded, detectives spoke with girls, some of whom were 15 or younger. Again, folks, chew on that. 15 or younger. And this scumbag Dershowitz is hanging out at his house while the police are rifling through this dude's trash to find DNA evidence. What a hell of a guy, folks. How is this not a RICO case again? How is this not a criminal conspiracy? How is this not a racketeering case? After taking the case, Mr. Dershowitz responded, as was his way, with hardball tactics. He gathered information from the girls' postings on social media accounts, which he claimed showed they were drug users or had lied to Mr. Epstein about their age. Of course they lied to him about their age. They were told not to tell Epstein his age. Okay? They were told that by the handlers. He also helped put together a defense team that included Roy Black, the prominent trial lawyer, and Ken Starr, who led the investigation into President Bill Clinton's involvement with Monica Lewinsky. Ken Starr, another numbnut, another moron, another guy who was involved in an impeachment that never should have occurred. What an absolute and utter shit show. We see all of these names that are recycled throughout all of these stories like terrible coaches in the NFL who keep finding jobs. I don't understand. I just don't understand. A local prosecutor, after meeting with Mr. Epstein's defense team, recommended that he be charged only with a misdemeanor. The chief of the Palm Beach Police Department was so outraged by the proposal that he wrote a letter to the Justice Department asking it to get involved in the case. Over time, authorities found evidence suggesting that Mr. Epstein had paid dozens of girls for sexual services. However, Mr. Dershowitz and other lawyers struck a deal in which Mr. Epstein agreed to plead guilty in a Florida court to one count of soliciting prostitution and another of procuring a person under 18 for prostitution. At the same time, federal officials agreed not to bring any charges against Mr. Epstein or any of his potential co-conspirators. Must be nice. It really must be nice to have this kind of pull. You just get away with it, whatever you want. You know you're going to get a great deal. A Florida judge sentenced Mr. Epstein to 18 months in jail, though he was allowed to spend days working on the outside. He was released in 2019 after serving 13 months, a shortened sentence for good behavior, and had to register as a sex offender. For good behavior? How could he exhibit good behavior if he was never there? He was in a wing by himself. Nobody bothered him. He had his own private security personnel there. And then again, now, look at how the first arrest went down, and now look at the second one. The first one, he had everything afforded to him, a security team, etc., etc. Ask yourself, why was he not afforded the same thing the second time around? Who abandoned him? Where were his handlers at this point? For a criminal lawyer, the residue of a case can remain long after it ends. 20 years ago, Mr. Derschowitz received death threats after he helped secure Mr. Simpson's acquittal on murder charges. And as a writer, he has imagined even worse plots. In one of his legal thrillers, The Advocate's Devil, a lawyer discovers that a man for whom he had won acquittal on rape charges is stalking his daughter. But Mr. Epstein's case has come back to haunt him in ways he never expected. Well, that's what happens when you're involved with people like Epstein. For people that claim that they're so goddamn smart, they sure are coming off pretty damn stupid, aren't they, folks? I have been criticized for the cases I've taken, he said, but no one has ever criticized my personal life. The events that pulled him back into Mr. Epstein's orbit began unfolding in 2008. That year, two lawyers, Bradley J. Edwards and Paul G. Cassell, filed a lawsuit accusing the Justice Department of violating the rights of two women involved in Mr. Epstein's case by not allowing them to challenge his plea deal. Then, in 2011, a British newspaper, the Mail on Sunday, published an article about Virginia Roberts, another of Mr. Epstein's accusers, who was then living in Australia. Miss Roberts, now a 32-year-old mother of three, told the newspaper that Mr. Epstein first paying her for sexual services when she was 15. She also described traveling around the world on Mr. Epstein's jet. So what she's talking about is when she first came from Mar-a-Lago, they brought her in and they under the pretense of, oh, we can give you $200-300 for a massage. So they bring her in, a 15-year-old girl, she does the massage, and then they groom her from there. Basically the Stockholm syndrome. They make her think everything's all right, and they get her involved in all of this. So before you know it, you think that this is just your way of life. Soon afterwards, the lawyers suing the Justice Department interviewed Miss Roberts and asked her if any of Mr. Epstein's friends might have information about his exploitation of girls. When they mentioned Mr. Dershowitz, she replied yes, according to a transcript of the 2011 call. But last December, Mr. Dershowitz was drawn into the Justice Department lawsuit in an entirely different way. In a motion filed that month, Miss Roberts claimed that she and Mr. Dershowitz had sex when she was a minor aboard Mr. Epstein's plane at the money manager's homes in New York, New Mexico, and the Virgin Islands. Now we know for sure that Dershowitz was at all of these places. Was he there the same time as Virginia Roberts? Not positive yet. We have to make those connections, but it's hard. Everything's murky. She also asserted that Mr. Epstein had sexually trafficked her to other powerful friends, including Prince Andrew, the Duke of York. Buckingham Palace rejected the claims against the prince. Yeah, so much so now you look back to today. Now, again, here's where we can take a good stark look, right? Back then, all they did was issue a denial. They thought it was going to go away. Now the print is completely screwed. The judge later struck Miss Roberts' motion from the court filing, but by then, the accusations were being widely reported and broadcast. Mr. Dershowitz's phone was ringing with calls from reporters seeking comment. Aw, poor powerful lawyer. Gotta answer some comments for hanging out with a pedophile. At the very least, Dershowitz enabled this behavior. At every opportunity, he called Miss Roberts' claims outrageous falsehoods and called the lawyers who had made the filing, Mr. Edwards and Mr. Cassell, villains who helped fabricate the claims against him. Mr. Dershowitz said he would seek to have them disbarred, adding he had diary records and other information to show he was not at locations where Miss Roberts claimed they had met. They're prepared to lie, cheat, and steal, Mr. Dershowitz said in an interview on CNN in January. Because you have diary entries, that means we should believe you? Dear diary, I did not molest anybody today. Please make sure you let the police know if they come looking for me. What does that even mean? The two lawyers who declined to be interviewed for this article filed a defamation lawsuit against Mr. Dershowitz, who responded with his own counterclaim. Mr. Boyd's firm soon entered the fray. In late 2014, a lawyer at the firm Boyd, Schiller & Flexner agreed to represent Ms. Roberts in legal matters not directly related to the Justice Department lawsuit. When Mr. Dershowitz's name surfaced in that lawsuit, another lawyer at the firm agreed to represent him before realizing that Ms. Roberts was already a client. After the lawyer withdrew, Mr. Dershowitz expressed anger, saying that he had already told the firm his legal strategy before he was made aware of the conflict. Oh boy. I was never even aware of that. So here we go. Again, we're learning something very important in this evolution of the Epstein Chronicles, this new segment that we've introduced. He was a client of the firm. Why would he go to that firm and try and hook it up? He knew. They didn't know. Please. He was trying to do this exactly so he could pigeonhole boys. Wow. Wow. That's a huge revelation, folks. Mr. Boyce called the claim frivolous. This idea of going to the press and asserting there is a conflict when you are not willing to make that claim in court is irresponsible, said the lawyer, who is perhaps best known for representing the Democratic presidential candidate Al Gore against George W. Bush in his challenge to the 2000 election results. That incident, however, was only the start of an escalating battle in which each man has accused the other of twisting words and spewing falsehoods. In October, during a deposition in the defamation case against him, Mr. Dershowitz testified that he had received a confidential phone call from a female friend of Miss Roberts who provided him with troubling information. According to Mr. Dershowitz's testimony, the woman said Miss Roberts had told her that she had been pressured to level sexual charges at Mr. Dershowitz. She also described a plan to accuse Mr. Wexner of having sex with Miss Roberts when she was underage. Virginia had her lawyers hope to get $1 billion, B-I-L-L-I-O-N, $1 billion or half of his net worth, Mr. Dershowitz testified. He was told, calling the plan an extortion attempt. Yeah, okay, sure. So what your boy Dershowitz is doing here is he's bringing all these other MFers into this situation, bringing all these other names up so he can muddy the waters. So the entire scope goes off of him. A lawyer for Mr. Wexner, John W. Zeiger, did not respond to telephone calls, but a person briefed on the matter, but who was not authorized to speak publicly about it, said that Mr. Wexner had never met Miss Roberts and no extortion attempts was made. So there you go. Dershowitz is lying again. So the more we read this stuff, folks, the more it seems like Dershowitz is playing a game here, and the guiltier he looks, in my opinion. Mr. Dershowitz says he wants nothing more than for Miss Roberts to publicly retract her claims. He insists that Mr. Boyce privately told him that he believed Mr. Dershowitz was innocent and that Miss Roberts, while believing the allegations, was mistaken or confused. Mr. Boyce says Mr. Dershowitz's claims are ludicrous. I never said that to him, and that I concluded that my client's assertions were incorrect, he said. I didn't say that. I didn't say anything like that. On Friday, Mr. Dershowitz filed an affidavit in a Florida state court containing notes of his conversations with Mr. Boyce that he says supports his account. In it, he described Mr. Boyes as telling him that if his client refused to withdraw her claim, he could not ethically continue to represent her. Again, with his notes, his diary. So, again, well, let's investigate ourselves, is basically what he's saying. What a BS artist. Do you have anyone to corroborate your claims there, Mr. Dershowitz? Hours later, Mr. Boyes' firm asked the Florida judge to seal Mr. Dershowitz's affidavit, and in a related filing, Mr. Boyes described some of Mr. Dershowitz's assertions as misleading or flatly untrue. In this intensifying game of legal chicken, it is not clear who will flinch first. Miss Roberts seems unwilling to yield and used a recent court filing to fire back at Mr. Dershowitz. He is lying by denying that he had sex with me, Miss Roberts said, who declined to be interviewed for this article. Mr. Dershowitz says he is no longer friendly with Mr. Epstein, who lives once again in his lavish Upper East Side mansion. Still, like it or not, the lawyer remains tethered to him. Having defended Mr. Epstein, he said that he could not express his feelings about him. Several well-known criminal defense lawyers said that personal attacks were an occupational hazard. Alan has never shied away from a fight in his life, said Abe D. Lowell, a lawyer in Washington whose clients have included the lobbyist Jack Abramoff, who was convicted of corruption in 2006. He has been that kind of lightning rod. For a man who has never lacked for self-confidence, Mr. Dershowitz now finds himself saddled with regret. 2 clients, he said, have backed away from him because his accusers' claims, and he worries whether universities like Johns Hopkins will invite him to give speeches or present him with awards. Well, again, stop hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein. This isn't about your defense of him. You're vacationing with this sick bastard, dude. You don't know what's going on. You've seen the artwork in his house. That's normal. If that's normal, then the people you hang out with are abnormal. He now says he thinks that he should have said no when Epstein called. Yeah, every single time, you grifting SOB. I think I do regret having taken this case in light of everything that has happened since, he said. If I could give the money I made in this case and have this episode of my life erased, I'd do it. All right, well, donate the money you made then. Donate that money. Give it to a woman's charity, an abused woman's charity. Why not? If you feel like that money is dirty now that you know who he is and what he stands for, then why'd you keep it there, Dershie? Why did you keep the money? All right, folks, listen. This is what I'm talking about. We've learned some pretty interesting things in this article today, and this is why the evolution of the Epstein Chronicles is going to continue. So I hope that you folks took away as much from this as I did. I hope that you found it informative, and I hope that you enjoyed this segment. And remember, this year, 2020, this is the year, folks. This is the year that we're turning predators into prey. If you would like to contact me, you can do that at bobbycapucci@protonmail.com. That's BOBBYCAPUCCI@protonmail.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can do that by clicking on the GoFundMe link in the description box. I'll be back later on tonight with our daily drop. Catch you guys then.